History often conceals the most uncomfortable truths about our greatest minds. Throughout the centuries, syphilis has silently claimed some of humanity's most brilliant artists, philosophers, writers, and composers. Before the discovery of penicillin in the 1940s, this physically transmitted disease was essentially a death sentence. The stigma surrounding syphilis was so powerful that families, biographers, and physicians routinely concealed the truth, attributing deaths to brain fever, nervous exhaustion, or simple decline. Even today, many history books perpetuate these sanitized versions of famous lives. Their stories illuminate not only the tragic toll of this disease, but also how our understanding of history changes when we look beyond the official narratives. Al Capone. Al Capone ruled Chicago's criminal empire with an iron fist during the Prohibition era. At the height of his power, he controlled illegal alcohol distribution, gambling operations, and prostitution rings that generated millions of dollars annually. His brutal efficiency and willingness to eliminate rivals made him the most feared gangster in America. Law enforcement seemed powerless against him until they found an unlikely weapon: tax evasion charges. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and sent to the notorious Alcatraz penitentiary. It was there that doctors made a discovery that would explain his eventual downfall. Capone had contracted syphilis as a young man, likely during his early days working in brothels before his rise to power. The disease had been silently progressing through his body for years. By the time Capone was released from prison in 1939, the syphilis had advanced to its tertiary stage, attacking his brain with devastating effect. The transformation was shocking to those who had known the sharp, calculating crime boss. Capone's cognitive abilities had deteriorated to the level of a 12-year-old child. He would spend hours fishing in his swimming pool at his Florida estate, convinced he was catching fish. He held conversations with people who weren't there and flew into rages over imaginary slights. The great irony of Capone's story is that by the time of his decline, penicillin had become available as a treatment for syphilis. Had the disease been caught earlier, or had treatment come sooner, Capone might have recovered. Instead, he died in 1947 at age 48. His death certificate listed stroke and pneumonia as the causes, but the underlying culprit, neurosyphilis, had already destroyed the mind that once commanded Chicago's underworld. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was the embodiment of the American dream, a brilliant businessman, daring aviator, and successful film producer. Tall, handsome, and fabulously wealthy, he dated Hollywood's most beautiful actresses and set aviation records that made him a national hero. Yet in his later years, this dynamic titan became a bizarre recluse who hid from the world in darkened hotel rooms. The conventional explanation for Hughes's transformation focuses on obsessive-compulsive disorder and mental illness. However, compelling evidence suggests that syphilis may have played a significant role in his deterioration. During his Hollywood years, Hughes was notoriously promiscuous, maintaining simultaneous relationships with numerous women at a time when syphilis was rampant and difficult to treat effectively. As Hughes aged, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He developed an obsessive fear of germs and contamination. He wrote pages of detailed instructions for mundane tasks like opening a can of peaches. He refused to cut his hair, beard, or fingernails, and avoided bathing for extended periods. These symptoms, the paranoia, the obsessive rituals, the progressive withdrawal from reality, are consistent with the neurological effects of tertiary syphilis. By the time of his death in 1976, the once robust Hughes weighed only 90 pounds. His body was so deteriorated that the FBI had to use fingerprints to positively identify him. If Hughes did have syphilis, His immense wealth and power may have actually hastened his decline. His doctors were reportedly too intimidated by his reputation to insist on proper testing or treatment. The man who had everything money could buy was denied the simple antibiotic that could have saved him. John Barrymore. John Barrymore was theatrical royalty, a member of the legendary Barrymore acting dynasty, and celebrated as the Great Profile for his striking good looks. His performances in Shakespeare's Richard III and Hamlet established him as the foremost classical actor of his generation. When Hollywood beckoned, he became one of the biggest movie stars of the early sound era, commanding enormous salaries and adoration from fans worldwide. The official narrative of Barrymore's decline blames his legendary alcoholism. He certainly drank prodigiously throughout his life, and alcohol undoubtedly contributed to his problems. But in his final years, Barrymore's mental state deteriorated in ways that seemed to go beyond simple intoxication. He couldn't remember his lines, even for brief scenes. He behaved erratically and unpredictably, sometimes appearing not to understand where he was or what he was supposed to be doing. Directors working with Barrymore during his final films resorted to elaborate tricks to mask his condition. They fed him dialogue through hidden earpieces and filmed his scenes in tiny fragments that could be spliced together. They used cue cards and stand-ins. The once great actor had become barely functional, a shadow of the commanding presence he had once been. When Barrymore died in 1942 at age 60, the official causes were listed as cirrhosis of the liver, kidney failure, and pneumonia. But many medical historians now believe that neurosyphilis was a significant contributing factor to his mental decline. The Barrymore family had powerful reasons to conceal such a diagnosis. The stigma would have been devastating to their theatrical legacy. The full truth may have died with John Barrymore himself. Paul Muni. Paul Muni was one of the most respected actors of Hollywood's golden age, renowned for his extraordinary ability to completely transform himself into different characters. His performance in the story of Louis Pasteur earned him an Academy Award, and his portrayals of Émile Zola and Benito Juárez cemented his reputation as cinema's greatest chameleon. Critics marveled at how completely Muni could disappear into a role. Yet, at the height of his career, Muni began to withdraw from public life. The official explanation cited arthritis in his hands and heart problems as the reasons for his early retirement. But those who worked closely with Muni noticed troubling signs: occasional memory lapses, moments of strange behavior on set, and a growing tendency toward isolation. Some historians have speculated that undiagnosed syphilis may have been the true cause of Muni's decline. The disease was common during his era, and the shame associated with it was so profound that many sufferers went to extraordinary lengths to hide their condition. Muni made his final film at age 61, and then virtually vanished from public view, spending his remaining years in seclusion. If he did suffer from syphilis, the stigma of the disease might explain why his true condition remained hidden. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was the most celebrated wit of Victorian England, a brilliant playwright and author whose works like The Importance of Being Earnest and The Picture of Dorian Gray remain beloved to this day. His legendary conversational skills made him the toast of London society, and his epigrams are still quoted more than a century after his death. But Wilde's glittering career came crashing down when he was convicted of gross indecency for his homosexual relationships and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in prison. The brutal conditions of Victorian imprisonment devastated Wilde's health. When he emerged in 1897, he was a broken man, physically weakened, socially ostracized, and financially ruined. He fled to France, where he lived in poverty under an assumed name. his health continued to deteriorate, plagued by severe ear infections that spread to his brain. According to his closest friends, Wilde knew he had syphilis. His friend Robert Sherard later confirmed that Wilde knew himself to be a syphilitic. 4 of Wilde's intimate companions revealed after his death that physicians had diagnosed syphilis as the cause of his ear infection and the subsequent brain inflammation that killed him. Wilde had received mercury treatments, the standard therapy for syphilis at the time, suggesting his doctors were treating him for the disease. Even as his body failed, Wilde's mind remained characteristically sharp. On his deathbed, in a cheap Paris hotel room, he reportedly looked at the ugly wallpaper and quipped, "One of us has to go." He died on November 30th, 1900, at age 46. The official cause was listed as meningitis, but this was almost certainly the final manifestation of the syphilis that had been destroying his nervous system for years. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe invented the detective story, pioneered psychological horror, and wrote some of the most haunting poetry in the English language. His tales of madness, death, and the supernatural have influenced countless writers and continue to captivate readers nearly 2 centuries after his death. Fittingly, Poe's own death became as mysterious as any of his Gothic tales. On October 3, 1849, Poe was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that were not his own and unable to explain what had happened to him. He was taken to a hospital where he drifted in and out of consciousness for 4 days, plagued by hallucinations and delirium. He died on October 7th at age 40, without ever being able to give a coherent account of his final days. Countless theories have been proposed to explain Poe's mysterious end: alcoholism, rabies, cholera, heart disease, even murder. But a compelling case can be made for neurosyphilis. In the years before his death, Poe had shown signs of progressive mental instability. He also displayed an unusual sensitivity to alcohol, becoming intoxicated and ill after drinking amounts that would barely affect most people, which is a documented symptom of neurological damage from syphilis. Poe's death certificate listed congestion of the brain as the cause, a term that could describe the meningitis that occurs in late-stage syphilis. The mystery of his final days may never be fully solved, but syphilis remains one of the most plausible explanations for the tragic end of America's master of the macabre. Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the most influential philosophers of the modern era. His provocative ideas about morality, religion, and human nature, including his famous declaration that God is dead, continue to shape philosophical discourse today. Works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil established him as a revolutionary thinker who challenged the foundations of Western thought. In January 1889, on a street in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being beaten. According to legend, he threw his arms around the animal's neck to protect it, and then collapsed. This dramatic incident marked the beginning of his complete mental breakdown. He was just 44 years old. In the days following his collapse, Nietzsche sent bizarre letters to friends, signing them alternately as Dionysus and the Crucified One. He was admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Basel, where doctors diagnosed him with syphilis. Medical records indicate that Nietzsche had contracted the disease around 1866, likely from a prostitute, and had been treated for it in the years that followed. Otto Binswanger, the renowned director of the Jena Mental Asylum who later treated Nietzsche, was an expert on general paralysis of the insane, the term then used for the dementia caused by tertiary syphilis, and presented Nietzsche to his students as a case study. Nietzsche spent the remaining 11 years of his life in a state of profound mental darkness, first in the asylum and later in the care of his mother and sister. He never wrote another word of philosophy. The man who had proclaimed the arrival of the Übermensch, the superior human who would transcend conventional morality, was reduced to crouching in corners, incoherent and unaware of the world around him. He died in August 1900, having spent nearly a third of his life in madness. Some modern scholars have questioned the syphilis diagnosis, suggesting alternatives like frontotemporal dementia, but the weight of contemporary medical evidence strongly supports the original assessment. Guy de Maupassant. Guy de Maupassant is widely considered the greatest French short story writer. In just 11 years of professional writing, he produced over 300 short stories and 6 novels, establishing himself as a master of the naturalist style. Stories like The Necklace and Boule de Suif remain staples of world literature, celebrated for their precise observation of human nature and their devastating ironic twists. Maupassant contracted syphilis in 1874 when he was just 24 years old, the beginning of what would become a prolific but increasingly troubled career. He was notoriously promiscuous, frequently visiting prostitutes, and he refused to undergo consistent treatment for his condition. For years, he managed to function despite the disease, channeling his experiences and anxieties into his writing. Many of his most powerful stories deal with themes of madness and psychological breakdown that would prove grimly prophetic. By the late 1880s, the syphilis had begun to destroy Maupassant's mind. He became obsessed with the idea of flies eating his brain. He suffered hallucinations and paranoid delusions. He grew increasingly isolated, preferring solitude to the company of others. His 1887 story, Le Horla, about a man who believes he is being possessed by an invisible entity, reads as an eerily autobiographical account of his deteriorating mental state. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec captured the vibrant, decadent nightlife of Belle Époque Paris like no other artist. His distinctive posters for the Moulin Rouge and other cabarets revolutionized graphic design and elevated commercial art to the realm of fine art. His paintings of dancers, prostitutes, and performers immortalized a world of gaslight and absinthe that has fascinated viewers for over a century. Toulouse-Lautrec was born into aristocracy, but his body bore the consequences of generations of inbreeding. His parents were first cousins, and both of his grandmothers were sisters. He suffered from a rare genetic bone disorder that caused his legs to stop growing after childhood fractures, leaving him with an adult torso, but the legs of a child. Standing barely 4 feet 8 inches tall, he used a cane to walk and endured constant physical pain throughout his short life. Finding acceptance among the prostitutes and performers of Montmartre, Toulouse-Lautrec became a fixture of the brothels, sometimes moving in for weeks at a time. It was there, around 1888, that he contracted syphilis from a prostitute named Rosa La Rouge. He medicated his physical and emotional pain with prodigious quantities of alcohol. His signature drink, the earthquake, combined half absinthe with half cognac. He even kept a hollow cane filled with booze. In 1899, Toulouse-Lautrec's family had him committed to a sanatorium for 3 months to treat his alcoholism. He attempted to prove his sanity by drawing circus scenes from memory, a remarkable demonstration of his undiminished artistic powers. But his return to Paris was short-lived. The combined effects of alcoholism and advancing syphilis took their toll. In March 1901, he suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed. On September 9, 1901, he died at his mother's estate just weeks before his 37th birthday. His last words were directed at his eccentric father, who had shown up to swat flies by his deathbed. Le vieux con, the old fool, Franz Schubert. Franz Schubert, was perhaps the most prolific composer in history relative to his lifespan. In just 31 years, he created over 1,000 works, including more than 600 songs, symphonies, chamber music, and piano works of extraordinary beauty. Franz Liszt called him the most poetic musician who ever lived. Even Beethoven, on his deathbed, examined some of Schubert's works and exclaimed, "Truly, the spark of divine genius resides in this Schubert." In late 1822, at age 25, Schubert contracted syphilis, most likely during a night of carousing with his friend Franz von Schubert in the less respectable districts of Vienna. The shame of the diagnosis was overwhelming. Schubert wrote to a friend of the brightest hopes coming to naught, and of finding nothing but pain in love and friendship. His friends later burned many of his letters and diaries to conceal the true nature of his illness. Despite his illness, Schubert entered an astonishing period of creativity. Many of his greatest works date from the years following his diagnosis, including the song cycle Winterreise, Winter Journey, with its haunting meditations on loneliness and death. Recent scientific analysis of Schubert's hair has revealed extremely high levels of mercury, the standard treatment for syphilis at the time, confirming that he underwent extensive treatment for the disease. In November 1828, Schubert fell seriously ill with fever, headaches, and vomiting. The syphilis had ravaged his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to infection. Ironically, the mercury treatments he had received may have contributed to his weakened state. Just 2 weeks after taking to his bed, Schubert died. He was 31 years old. His death certificate listed typhoid fever, but modern historians believe this was likely a secondary infection striking a body already devastated by syphilis and mercury poisoning. At his own request, Schubert was buried near Beethoven, the composer he had admired all his life. Robert Schumann. Robert Schumann was one of the quintessential Romantic composers, creating music of extraordinary emotional depth and imagination. His piano works, symphonies, and songs, many inspired by his passionate love for the pianist Clara Wieck, represent some of the finest achievements of 19th-century music. He was also an influential music critic who championed younger composers like Chopin and Brahms. In 1831, at age 21, Schumann contracted syphilis from a prostitute. He wrote in his diary of a wound causing biting and gnawing pain, almost certainly a reference to a syphilitic lesion. Years later, not long before his death, he scribbled a note recorded by his doctor. In 1831, I was syphilitic and treated with arsenic. For over 2 decades, Schumann appeared to have escaped the disease's worst effects, experiencing a long latency period during which he created his greatest works. But in the early 1850s, Schumann's mental health began to deteriorate dramatically. He experienced vivid auditory hallucinations, at first hearing angelic voices dictating music to him, but increasingly hearing demonic voices threatening to drag him to hell. He suffered from profound depression, alternating with periods of manic energy. In late 1853, the 20-year-old Johannes Brahms arrived at the Schumann household, and Robert recognized him immediately as a genius. But within months, Schumann's world would collapse. On February 27, 1854, during Carnival in Düsseldorf, Schumann slipped out of his house, wearing only his dressing gown and slippers. He walked to a bridge over the Rhine and threw himself into the icy water. Fishermen rescued him, but Schumann knew he could no longer be trusted. He asked to be committed to a mental asylum, fearing he might harm his beloved Clara or their children. Schumann spent the remaining 2.5 years of his life at the asylum in Endenich. Clara was forbidden to visit, as doctors believed such contact would agitate him. He experienced periods of lucidity during which he corresponded with friends and even continued to compose, but increasingly he was lost in delusion. He paced incessantly, held conversations with accusatory voices, and had to be restrained during violent episodes. By the end, Schumann was refusing food, perhaps deliberately starving himself. Clara was finally permitted to visit just 2 days before his death, on July 29, 1856. He smiled at her and tried to embrace her, but could no longer speak. He was 46 years old. These 11 remarkable individuals represent just a fraction of the countless people whose lives were cut short or devastated by syphilis before the antibiotic era. By some estimates, as many as 15% of the population in 19th-century cities may have been infected at some point in their lives. The disease made no distinctions based on talent, wealth, or status. It claimed gangsters and philosophers, actors and composers, writers and artists with equal indifference. The stigma surrounding syphilis was often as destructive as the disease itself. Patients avoided diagnosis and treatment out of shame. Families concealed the truth from doctors and biographers. Official records attributed deaths to brain fever or nervous exhaustion rather than acknowledge the true cause. This conspiracy of silence persisted for generations, distorting our understanding of history and perpetuating the myth that these brilliant minds were destroyed by simple alcoholism or mysterious decline. Today, syphilis can be cured with simple antibiotics. A course of penicillin injections is usually sufficient to eliminate the infection completely. Yet these stories remain relevant. They remind us how many brilliant minds were lost to a disease that now seems so treatable. They show us the terrible human cost of stigma and shame, which prevented so many from seeking the help they needed. And they demonstrate how our understanding of history can change dramatically when we look beyond the sanitized versions of famous lives to confront uncomfortable truths. Al Capone, Howard Hughes, John Barrymore, Paul Muni, Oscar Wilde, Edgar Allan Poe, Friedrich Nietzsche, Guy de Maupassant, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Franz Schubert, and Robert Schumann. Each of these individuals left an indelible mark on human culture. Their achievements endure, despite the disease that claimed them. But their stories also serve as a poignant reminder of mortality's power to humble even the greatest among us, and of how much the world lost when their lights were extinguished too soon.